We're making it through. We are almost there. Okay, so the week 4 material that we went over started to go into market structure and concentration. This one's actually probably most important for your projects in this class because we're going to talk a lot about thinking through markets and things like that. Okay, so first we start off with 3 important concepts: market structure, conduct, and performance. Market structure is like, hey, how many firms are there? What's the industry concentration? Is there ease of entry and exit? Can I come in easily or not? It's some of the backbones for how does the market look. Conduct is, okay, well, how does this business conduct itself? Does it have high prices, low prices? Does it advertise? What platform does it advertise on? Is there lots of research and development? Have they bought up a bunch of other countries? Performance is the idea of profitability and social welfare. So there's 2 different real measures for performance of a firm. Some of them are in how much money do they make? Like, that's great. That's profitability. There's also social welfare. Did they make the world a better place? Sometimes that's the goal of many companies, and we have to think about that when we're considering performance. So after that, we went through the idea of the feedback critiques. That's the idea that, like, conduct can affect market structure, market structure can inform performance, performance can affect any of the other ones, right? The interconnected loop that happens is none of the structure, conduct, or performance can really operate on its own. It's that we do have this feedback part where they can affect each other, especially through the form of feedback, right? So if there is a lot of animosity towards a firm, that will affect their performance. And if their performance suffers, then that will change the conduct of the business, because they might decide to conduct themselves in a different way, or they may not, right? Which might affect market structure, because maybe there's not going to be as many people in that market, or there might be more who want to compete with them. So we use the idea of the telecommunications industry to very heavily work through these 3 different concepts. I'm not going through all of that again, but you're more than welcome to. Then we had 2 different types of indexes we talked about. The first is the Rothschild index. This is an index of between 0 and 1 that tells you how much competition there is for firms. At a 0, that is just perfect competition. Every single firm is producing exactly the same thing, and there are so many of them that none of them affect anything. There are tons. All the way to a level of 1, there is a very unique item sold by a monopoly who is the only person who can sell it. Now, remember, monopolies don't always have to be the only person in the world. It can be the only person in a geographic region, or there's some sort of legal barrier that causes them to be the only person producing a good or service. So the Rothschild index looks at the total elasticity in the market versus the elasticity for this one firm, and we kind of look at this relationship. So for example, if we were thinking about food, that might be something that's very, very competitive. While if we're thinking about something closer to chemicals or paper, that might be something where we're more likely to have a monopoly, but there's very few firms operating for cost. I don't know if y'all can see that, but my cat is at the top of the stairs, just very creepily staring at me. Okay, then. So anyways, after that, we start talking about profitability. And when we talk about profitability, we need to think about the learner's index. So the learner's index is essentially how much market power you have, or the ability to be able to affect prices, right? If you have a lot of power, you have the ability to have high markups. That means that you probably are a majority of this industry, or you have a large control over the products, right? So learner's index, same thing, 0 to 1. 0, you can have no markups on your goods. You essentially are stuck at whatever the price in the market is. There's no choices for you. While all the way over at 1, which indicates some price competition, but the firm has lots of market power, right? As we get closer and closer to 1, that's when we get closer to this is the person who has total control over what this price is going to be in the market. So then we talk about the markup factors, and that's just like how much we increase the price on goods and services, and we compare the 2. We talked about competition all the way from our different types of models. So remember, perfectly competitive is where R equals 0, L equals 0. There's no markup. We have many buyers, identical products, free entry and exit, so many firms, identical products. That's the first situation. This is what we talk about a majority of the time in this class. And these are price takers. They're people who have to take whatever price there is in industry. Now, it's not necessarily realistic. It's very rare that we have an industry where things are so separate. It tends to be that there's at least some product differentiation. There's some small differences. There might be some control a little bit over the price of maybe a Pentel pen versus a Sharpie pen versus a Pilot G2 pen, right? So we have to kind of think about that when we're considering if something is perfect competition, but it's still a really great place to start. Perfect competitions are marked by the fact by their marginal revenue curve is flat. So remember, we produce at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Their marginal revenue equals their price. It is a flat curve for monopoly or for monosopy or for oligopoly or duopolies, whatever else. I think we talk about monopolistic competition in this class. I don't really make you go through a bunch of those other ones. Those have a downward sloping demand curve and therefore a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. So we have to think about the firm's decisions. How much do they want to produce, what quantity they want to produce, and whether they want to enter and exit the market. And that is all dependent on if marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, we will increase the amount that we are producing. If marginal cost is above marginal revenue, we will decrease the amount that we're producing because we're losing money at that point. Until we get to the sweet spot where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. We talked a little bit about temporary shutdown decisions. This basically comes down to, can we afford the variable cost or not? If we can afford to pay our workers and put some money towards rent, that is preferable, even if working at a loss, to just paying the rent and not having any workers and not making any money whatsoever and being out that total amount of money. All right, so then we have to think about the loss comparisons. This is when we start thinking about the total fixed cost plus total variable cost minus total revenue. Total or variable cost and total revenue, those are a function of quantity, of how much we're actually going to be selling. We talk about the shutdown point, different output decisions. I went in depth into those, so I'm not going to go too deep into them now, but it's something to think about the entry and exit of firms. We also have to think about what's happening in the long run. It's cat, I swear. All right, so in the long run, we see that everything kind of gravitates down to where the marginal revenue equals the long run average cost curve equals the average total cost curve equals the marginal cost curves for perfect competition. In the long run, there might be economic profits for every other type of firm, but not for perfect competition because everything kind of goes to this point of zero. If there is profits to be made, new firms will come in and then eventually the profits will be driven out. If there is losses, firms will leave the market and then the loss kind of reduces too. Eventually we'll get to the point where we have the stasis. So then we summarize that and then we start talking about monopoly, which is the other extreme, right? We go from 0 to 1 and then everything in between is what happens in the real world, but we got to know those extremes to be able to talk about it. Monopoly is the idea of a price maker. These are people who are making the prices of a good and service because they have the power to be able to do so. They're the only provider of a good. We talked about Spectrum and Edwardsville, but there's plenty of things like this. Right? So this is when a single firm serves the entire market. We started talking about the sources of monopoly power. So economies of scale, economies of scope. There might be patent and legal barriers. It's not necessarily there's only one provider in the world. It's just that there is one provider in a geographic area or in an area that might be providing a good or service. Okay, so we have to think about managing a monopoly. We started going through calculating the marginal revenue. What does that mean? Because remember, we will eventually... Do I not have the graph here? I don't have the graph here. With that downward sloping demand curve and the downward sloping marginal revenue curve, there becomes a point where we will be making profit. When we operate at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, the demand curve is above that. We are going to have a markup that's similar to that difference in between where those connections are and where the willingness to pay is. Actually, we can just draw it if you want. That's probably pretty easy. Here. That's the idea of imperfect competition. So we'll just call this PC. We have this, right? We have the idea that we have a flat marginal revenue curve, and we have this swoopy marginal cost curve. When it comes to monopoly, in this case, we have a downward sloping demand curve. Marginal revenue is a little bit less than that, so downward sloping marginal revenue curve. We're going to have our marginal cost curve. This is the quantity that we would want to produce, right? But we're not producing it at this price that we would have if it's perfect competition. Instead, we will be producing where the demand curve is, where people are willing to pay because we are the only provider of this good or service. So we can charge people what they're willing to pay. So the price of the monopoly will be greater than the price in perfect competition. So why do we allow monopolies? Well, sometimes it makes sense. I mean, you don't want 12 different cable companies ripping up your front yard. You don't want 12 different water companies hooked up to your house. There's a lot of times where it might make sense to have only one provider of a good or service. Oh, okay. All right. With that, let's go ahead and look through the assignment, and then let's go ahead and look through the quiz, the most commonly missed questions. So for the first one, we talked about Patagonia. Everybody got this one right. Yeah, you did great on it, talking about their pricing and advertising strategies and stuff like that. After that, we said Edwardsville has one water company. Explain how the feedback critique could influence the change of the market structure. Well, that's a pretty simple one, right? So that's a government-owned entity. If people were really, really upset with it, What do? They vote for different people, and then there might be competition. So the feedback is if this affects performance and their conduct isn't very good, you might change the market structure. You might vote for new people. You might vote to get in a new water company. You might change things like that and move away from this monopoly power because you're so unhappy with it. That change in the market structure will then affect the conduct of companies as they're now competing, and will affect performance, as profit will be divided in between different companies or change companies. So that's just any real answer there that showed how feedback can affect the sort of three pieces, and those three pieces work together. Fine with me. Rothschild index, remember 0 to 1. It measures essentially how competitive a industry is. 0 is perfect competition, 1 is monopoly, and everything in between. We talked about Logitech cameras compared to the entire market for webcams has an RR index of 0.2. That means that there's a lot of competition in cameras. That makes sense. I mean, when was the last time you got a Logitech camera? Actually, don't answer that. We've done a lot of online schooling. Pretty much everybody has Logitech cameras, but back when I thought about this question a few years ago, that was not necessarily the case. Okay, so then we have to think about, let's see. The next one was about the grocery stores in Edwardsville, so we have Market Basket and Deerbergs. Aren't we getting a new one? I don't remember what it is, but I think we're getting a new store pretty soon, but both tend to be pricey. If a new competitor came to town and undercut those prices, what would happen? Well, you have more competition, right? Industry concentration loosens. That means that you have less market power. Prices are probably going to have to reduce because of this competition. Let's see. Oh, the figure below depicts the marginal cost, average cost, and marginal revenue curve for bushels of wheat. How much would you output where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, right? So we would output this 30 because that's where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. All right, what would the price of wheat be at this point? Well, we see that it's flat. We know that this is a perfectly competitive firm. There means that there's lots of people with the exact same price. So that'll be right here at 3, right? So it's going to be 3. Okay, and then we just had a bunch of true and false statements. So a perfectly competitive firm will shut down in the short run if the price is below the average total cost. Not necessarily true. It really matters for the average variable cost. That one's false. A firm's shutdown point is the output and price at which the firm's total revenue just equals the total variable cost. All right, well, that means that their average total revenue is equal to their average variable cost, right? Like, yeah, okay. That's about the point where we would start considering shutting down if we could not cover that variable cost. Perfectly competitive firms will sometimes operate even though they incur an economic loss. Yeah, all the time. Your store may not have a good day. That does not mean that you burn your rental contract and run away from it. Sometimes you operate at a loss. In a long run, a perfectly competitive firm can make economic profits because its marginal cost equals its average total cost. No, perfectly competitive firms are the one that cannot make economic profit in the long run. Monopolies can, sure. But even monopolistic competition, they can. Monopolistic competition, remember, is where you have slight product differentiation and more people in the market competing, but not to the point of perfect competition. Yeah, they still can have profits, but not perfectly competitive firms in the long run. All right, then entry of new firms into a perfectly competitive market raises the price. No, they're price takers, right? They take whatever price is in the market. All right, that was our assignment. Let's think about the quiz. The first one, agriculture is a vast and busy industry with many sellers and buyers. That's basically telling you, oh, this is a perfectly competitive market. All right, when visiting the farmer's market, you notice orange producers are selling bags of oranges for $10. Well, okay, what can we do here? So we know that this is a perfectly competitive firm. We know that there's probably no barriers to entry, right? Because these are people just selling bags of oranges. Could you go in and undercut prices? No, because in a perfectly competitive field, this would be a price taking situation. If everybody else is selling them for $10, you got to sell them for $10 too, because I bet your marginal cost is about $10. That's how it works when you consider in your opportunity cost stuff. Okay, but anyways. Does the marginal revenue curve differ from perfectly competitive firms to monopoly firms? Yes, we've already talked about that a bunch. Lerner's index. Remember, his Lerner index also goes from 0 to 1, right? It essentially shows things about like market power. So if a particular firm has a lot of market power, it'd be closer to 1. If that means they have a lot of control over prices, they can have markups on their goods and services. If it's closer to 0, they don't. They have no market power. They are always taking the price in the market, right? What does it measure? Market power, potential markups, all of those pieces. The Hammer Mill Paper Company has a Lerner index of 0.15. What does this mean? They can't mark it up very much. There's not a lot of growth there. All right, so next one, considering the cruise ship industry, these ships take passengers around the world to interesting destinations on vacations. During the COVID-19 pandemic, these firms have been suffering serious financial losses and been trying to entice their company or entice people in new ways. Describe the industry concentration. Well, I mean, there is some concentration, right? There's still a lot of regulatory hurdles. There's by far not free entry and exit, but it's not a monopoly either because there's still multiple things. I would consider this some sort of monopolistic competition. There's still competition in between a few different firms. All right. So let's see. A firm in a perfectly competitive market is having a tough week. They are having to pay $2,000 in rent and $1,000 in wages, yet they only made $1,500 in revenue. Should the firm shut down? Why or not? Well, let's see. They're making $1,500 in revenue. They're making, let's see, $2,000 in rent and $1,000 in wages. Well, yeah, that means that they can cover the wages and still put some towards rent. They probably want to stay open. They'd be operating at a loss, but that's a decision to operate at a loss in the short run. Describe the conduct of SIUE's MBA program in terms of pricing and advertising. That one I'm just leaving for y'all to answer. I'm sure you understand it better than I do, and I'm excited to read your answers. Okay. If the video games industry has a Rothschild index of 0.3, what does this mean? It's a fairly concentrated industry. All right. Or not fairly concentrated, fairly competitive industry. There's people competing, but it's not perfect competition. EA Games knows that. They charge way too much. Anyways, what type of markets can include markups, monopolistic competition, monopoly, basically anything besides perfect competition? What does it mean to be a price maker versus a price taker? Price maker means that you have some sort of market power and ability to affect the price. Price taker means that there are so many buyers and sellers selling identical goods that you cannot affect the price. Does a monopoly firm make an economic profit in the long run? Yes, if they're a good monopoly. But yes. It differs from perfect competition because there's no economic profit in the long run. Woo! All right, so we made it through all 4. Congratulations, you got this. I believe in you on this test. If you need anything, let me know. I know a lot of these videos are going to be up early, so some of you may be looking at them early, but when your test opens in week 5, you got this. I believe in you. If you need me, I got office hours or I'm available by email. Feel free to email me, and good luck. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.